The most successful fighter plane Japan ever built was designed to win the war in its first year and to lose it in every year after. The man who designed it knew the second half of that sentence before the first one had been proven. In the last episode, we followed a submarine the victor sank in secret. We end this one with an admission almost as strange, that the most feared aircraft of the early Pacific carried the seed of its own defeat in the very design that made it great, and that the engineer who drew it understood the flaw before it ever left the ground. The aircraft was the Zero. In Japanese, the Racing. The carrier fighter built by Mitsubishi and flown off the decks of the Imperial Navy from the opening day of the war. For roughly the first year, it was very close to unbeatable. It outranged, outturned, and outclimbed almost everything sent against it, and the men who fought it learned the hard way not to fight it on its own terms. The man who designed it was an engineer named Jiro Horikoshi. He survived the war. He wrote about the aircraft afterward, and what he left behind was not the pride of a triumphant designer, but something closer to a quiet, lifelong argument that his country had asked him to build the wrong weapon, and that he had built exactly what they asked.
To understand the argument, you have to understand what the aircraft actually was, stripped of its legend. The Zero was a single-engine, carrier-based fighter, and its defining quality was not speed and not firepower. It was lightness. It was, for its time, an astonishingly light aircraft for its size, and almost everything remarkable about it followed from that single fact. Lightness gave it range. It could escort bombers hundreds of miles out to sea and hundreds back, a reach that stunned the men on the receiving end, who had assumed no carrier fighter could possibly reach them. Lightness gave it maneuverability. At the speeds where early war dogfights were decided, it could turn inside almost any opponent, coming around onto a pursuer's tail in a way that felt, to the men it killed, like a violation of physics. Lightness gave it the climb and the agility that made its pilots in 1941 and 1942 seem to belong to a different and superior order of air war. But lightness is not free. An aircraft has only so much weight to spend, and every pound spent on one thing is a pound denied to another. The Zero spent its weight on range, on agility, on the guns. And to afford all of that, in an airframe kept deliberately, almost ruthlessly light, the design went without the things that in the end keep a pilot alive. That was the trade. That was the whole of it.
Here is the loop this episode follows to its end. A fighter is built to a set of demands so severe that no airframe could meet them all and still protect the man inside it. The engineer meets the demands anyway, by removing the protection. The aircraft that results is, for 1 year, the finest carrier fighter in the world, and its pilots are the most feared airmen in the Pacific. And then the enemy stops trying to beat it at its own game, changes the rules, and brings heavier, tougher, better protected machines. And the very lightness that had made the fighter great becomes the reason its pilots burn. The question that hangs over all of it is the one we will answer at the close. What did the designer know before the first aircraft ever flew about the flaw that would eventually kill the men who flew it? Not what he learned afterward, looking back. What he knew at the drafting board while he was drawing it. Because the most haunting thing about the Zero is not that it had a fatal weakness. Many weapons do. It is that the man who built it appears to have understood that weakness from the beginning. To have built it in knowingly, because the alternative was to refuse the demand. And in the Navy of that time, the demand was not something an engineer could refuse. So this is the shape of the story. A young engineer, working at the edge of what his industry could do, is handed a specification from the Navy that reads less like a design brief than a wish list, and a contradictory one. Build us a fighter, the Navy says, with the range to cross great stretches of ocean, the speed to catch anything, the agility to outturn anything, and the guns to destroy anything, and let it fly from the deck of a carrier. Each of those demands on its own is reasonable. Together, in one airframe, with the engines available at the time, they are very nearly impossible. The engineer finds the only path that satisfies them all. He cuts weight everywhere a designer can cut it, and then he cuts it where a designer is not supposed to. He leaves out the armor plate that would shield the pilot from gunfire. He leaves out the self-sealing fuel tanks that would let a punctured tank close itself before it caught fire. He builds, in other words, a machine that flies beautifully and burns easily. For a year, that bargain looks like genius. The fighter rules the sky. And then, the sky changes. This is the story of how the most successful weapon Japan ever fielded became a coffin for its best men, and of the man who saw it coming. We begin with the demand.
The specification came down from the Navy in the mid-1930s, and on first reading, it must have seemed almost unserious. The Navy wanted a new carrier fighter, and it wanted everything. It wanted a top speed higher than anything then flying off a Japanese deck. It wanted a climb rate to match. It wanted maneuverability at least equal to the agile biplane fighters the pilots loved, the ones that could turn on a coin. It wanted heavy armament, cannon, not just machine guns. It wanted the endurance to stay in the air for hours and the range to operate far out over open ocean. And all of it had to fold into an airframe light enough and strong enough to be flung off a carrier and caught again on the same small deck. Each requirement reflected a real lesson. The range came from the simple geography of the Pacific, where battles would be fought across distances no European Air Force had to plan for. The agility came from a doctrine that still believed the turning dogfight would decide air combat. The firepower came from the need to bring down increasingly sturdy enemy aircraft. None of it was foolish in isolation. But the engineers who first read the specification understood what the admirals issuing it had not fully reckoned with. Every one of those demands costs weight, and weight was the one currency the airframe did not have to spend.
The man who took on the problem was Jiro Horikoshi, the chief designer on the project at Mitsubishi. He was not a famous man at the time, and he did not seek to be. He was an aeronautical engineer of unusual gift, methodical and exacting, working in an industry that was still, by the standards of the great Western powers, young. Japan had built fine aircraft, but it was understood, by the engineers most of all, that the country's engines lagged behind. The most powerful, most reliable aero engines in the world were being built elsewhere. A Japanese designer could not simply specify a vastly more powerful engine to carry all the weight the Navy's demands implied, because the engine that would have made that easy did not exist in his country's factories. This is the constraint that shaped everything. If you cannot add power to carry more weight, then to gain performance, you must subtract weight instead. Every increase in speed, in climb, in range that Horikoshi wanted had to be bought not with a bigger engine, but with a lighter airframe wrapped around the modest one he had. So the design became, from the first lines on the drafting board, an exercise in subtraction. Not a fighter built up from a powerful core, but a fighter pared down to the bone around a limited one. And once you commit to winning by lightness, the question is no longer whether to remove weight. It is only how far you are willing to go.
Horikoshi and his team went very far indeed. They attacked weight at every level of the design. They used a new, lighter, stronger aluminum alloy in the structure where they could. They drilled lightning holes in the internal frames, carving away metal anywhere it was not strictly carrying load. They simplified, thinned, and trimmed wherever the stress calculations gave them room.
and the calculations were done with great care because the margins were narrow. The result was an airframe of remarkable efficiency, one in which almost nothing was carried that did not earn its place. This was not crude cost-cutting. It was the opposite, a refined, disciplined, deeply considered pursuit of the lowest possible weight for the performance required. In purely engineering terms, it was brilliant work, and it was recognized as such. The aircraft that emerged could do things the Navy had asked for that the engineers themselves had privately doubted were possible in one machine. But there is a floor to this kind of subtraction, and the floor is the human being in the cockpit and the fuel he flies on. There comes a point where the only remaining weight worth cutting is the weight that exists solely to keep the pilot alive. The steel plate behind his seat, the rubberized lining that would seal a fuel tank if a bullet passed through it. Those things are pure protection. They add nothing to speed, range, or agility. They are, from the cold standpoint of meeting the specification, dead weight. And the specification did not ask for them.
So they came out. The Zero went into service without armor plate to protect the pilot from gunfire striking from behind, and without self-sealing fuel tanks to contain a leak before it found a spark. These were not oversights. They were not things the designers forgot. They were deliberate omissions, made because the doctrine and the specification valued the offensive qualities of the aircraft, its reach, its agility, its sting, above the survival of the man flying it. The doctrine behind that choice has to be understood on its own terms, not ours. The thinking of the time, in that Navy, held that the best protection for a pilot was not armor, but performance. That an aircraft agile enough never to be hit needed no plate to stop the bullets that would never arrive. A fighter that could always turn away from danger did not need to absorb danger. On that logic, weight spent on armor was weight stolen from the very agility that kept the pilot safe. Protection, in this view, was self-defeating. It is a logic that holds only as long as the aircraft can always win the turning fight. As long as the Zero dictated the terms of combat, the bargain paid. The pilot's safety lay in his superiority, and his superiority lay in his lightness. And his lightness came from leaving the armor on the factory floor. The whole structure rested on a single assumption, that the enemy would keep fighting the Zero's kind of fight. For a year, the enemy did. And then, he stopped. But first, the year the bargain paid.
When the war opened across the Pacific in late 1941, the Zero arrived as a shock. The men who first met it in the air had been told, in effect, that no carrier fighter could do what it did. It appeared where it should not have been able to reach, having flown distances that broke the assumptions built into every Allied plan. It turned in a radius that left experienced pilots staring at empty sky where their target had been an instant before. It climbed away from trouble and came back down out of the sun. In those first months, in skies from the Central Pacific to the seas off Asia, it ran up a record of dominance that few fighters in history have matched over a comparable span. Part of that was the aircraft. A great deal of it was the men flying it. The Imperial Navy had entered the war with a corps of fighter pilots who were by any measure among the finest in the world. Long-trained, combat-seasoned from years of fighting on the Asian mainland, drilled to a standard most air forces could only envy. Put those men in an aircraft that could outrange and outturn anything they met, and the result was the air superiority of the early Pacific War. For a while, it genuinely seemed that the Navy had been right, that the bargain had been worth it, that performance was protection enough.
But the bargain was visible to the enemy, almost from the start, to anyone who survived contact and thought clearly about what he had seen. A captured example, studied on the ground, told the story plainly. The aircraft was light to the point of fragility. It carried no armor. Its fuel tanks were not protected.
A burst of fire that a sturdier fighter might shrug off could, against this one, be decisive. A single well-placed stream of bullets into the wing tanks or the fuselage could turn the Zero into a torch. The very thing that made it so dangerous in a turning fight, its feathery lightness, made it terribly easy to destroy if you could only bring your guns to bear for a moment. The problem in 1942 was bringing the guns to bear. You could not outturn the Zero. If you tried to dogfight it on its terms, to match it turn for turn at low speed, you would lose, and you would die. And many men did exactly that before the lesson took hold. The aircraft's weakness was real, but it was guarded by a strength that punished anyone who came close enough to exploit it the wrong way. So the early war settled into a brutal asymmetry. The Zero had a glass jaw and an iron fist, and as long as its enemies kept walking into the fist, the jaw never mattered. The answer would not come from a better turning fight. It would come from refusing to have one at all.
It is worth being clear about what the trade-off meant in human terms, because that is where its real cost lived. When a Zero was hit in a way that reached the fuel, it tended not to limp home. It tended to burn. And a pilot in a burning aircraft with no armor between him and the fire had very little time and very few options. The same design that let him fly out 200 miles and fight on arrival gave him almost nothing to survive the moment a few enemy rounds found their mark. In a sturdier fighter, a pilot might take damage, nurse a wounded machine back toward his carrier, and live to fly again the next day. In this one, too often, a hit that would have been survivable elsewhere was simply the end. For the Navy, in the first year, this cost was hidden by success. When you are winning, your aircraft are not being hit much, and the ones that are lost can be written off against a tide of victories. The fragility was a bill that had not yet come due. The core of superb veteran pilots was still largely intact, still dominating, still seemingly proof that the design philosophy worked. But a weapon that protects the man only by keeping him from ever being hit has made a wager against time. It is betting that the conditions of its supremacy will last. And conditions, in war, do not last. The enemy was already in laboratories and squadron-ready rooms working out how to change them.
The change, when it came, was not a better dogfighter. It was a refusal to dogfight. Allied pilots were taught, with increasing discipline through 1942 and into 1943, never to turn with the Zero. Use your strengths, the new doctrine said, not his. Their heavier fighters held an advantage in a dive and at high speed, so they were told to fight in the vertical, to come down fast from above, strike in a single firing pass, and keep going, using their momentum to climb away out of reach before the lighter aircraft could bring its turn to bear. Hit and run. Never linger. Never try to outturn what cannot be outturned. And they learned to fight in pairs that protected each other. One famous tactic had two fighters weaving across one another's tails, so that a Zero settling in behind one of them would find itself flying straight into the guns of the other. It was a simple, deadly idea, and it converted the Zero's greatest strength, its ability to get onto an enemy's tail, into a trap. The hunter became the hunted, lured into a crossfire by the very maneuver that had always won. None of this required a miracle aircraft. It required tactics, training, and discipline, and the willingness to stop playing the game the enemy was best at. Slowly, the asymmetry that had defined the early war began to reverse.
and the aircraft that had ruled the sky was about to meet something it could not adapt to, because it could no longer adapt at all.
In 1943, a new kind of enemy fighter began to appear over the Pacific in numbers, and it had been built, in part, to beat the Zero. It was heavier, it was more powerful, carried by an engine of a class Japan's industry could not match. It was rugged, built around armor and protected fuel tanks, able to absorb punishment that would have destroyed a lighter aircraft and keep flying. It could not turn with the Zero at low speed. It did not try to. It was faster in a dive, stronger in a climb at speed, and it was flown according to the new doctrine: strike from above, strike once, and leave. Against the Zero's strengths, it conceded the turning fight entirely, and against the Zero's weaknesses, it brought guns enough to exploit them in the half-second a firing pass allowed. The contest was no longer between two fighters. It was between two philosophies of design. One said, protect the pilot, build him a machine that can take a hit and accept the weight that costs. The other said, protect the pilot by making him untouchable and strip away everything that does not serve that. By 1943, the first philosophy was winning, because the second one had a fatal dependency. It only worked while the pilot stayed untouchable, and the new tactics existed precisely to make him touchable. The aircraft that had been a generation ahead in 1941 was by 1943 being outfought by machines built to a sounder principle.
And here, the deeper failure showed itself, not in the aircraft, but in the system that built it. The Zero barely changed. Through the years when its enemies were fielding new and better fighters in waves, the basic design soldiered on, refined at the edges, but never truly replaced. More powerful engines that might have restored its competitiveness were slow to arrive, and the airframe had been optimized so completely around its original light engine that it could not easily absorb a heavier, stronger one. The successors that were supposed to take its place came late, came in trouble, came in numbers too small to matter. The aircraft that had been the most advanced carrier fighter in the world was asked to keep fighting, year after year, against opponents that improved while it stood nearly still. This was not Horikoshi's failure alone, and it is not fair to lay it on the airframe. It was a failure of an industrial base that could not develop engines fast enough, of a high command that did not invest early enough in the next generation, of a war economy being slowly strangled. The Zero kept flying, not because it was still the best, but because it was what there was. So the trade-off that had been brilliant in 1941 became lethal in 1944. The same fragile, unarmored, unprotected aircraft was now being sent against enemies specifically equipped to set it on fire, and it had not gained the armor or the protected tanks that might have given its pilots a chance. The price of that was paid in the one resource the Navy could least afford to lose. Not aircraft, men. The superb veteran pilots of the early war, the long-trained, combat-hardened airmen who had made the Zero seem invincible or not replaceable. It had taken years to make each of them, and as the war turned, they began to die. In aircraft that gave them almost no margin to survive a mistake or a moment of bad luck. A veteran who might have nursed a damaged, sturdier fighter home instead went down in flames when a single burst found his fuel. The aircraft that had been built to make the most of an elite did nothing to preserve it. And the Navy could not rebuild what it was losing. The training pipeline, strained by fuel shortages and the sheer pace of attrition, turned out replacement pilots faster and faster, and less prepared.
So the worst possible spiral set in. The aircraft was now fragile and outclassed. The men sent up in it were now younger, greener, and more poorly trained. And they were facing an enemy who was better equipped, better protected, and growing more numerous by the month. Each of those facts made the others deadlier. The Zero had been designed for masters. By 1944, it was killing novices. Not the enemy's novices, but its own. The machine outlived the men it had been built to serve, and watched a new generation climb into it and burn.
Step back, and the contradiction at the center of it all becomes visible. The aircraft had been built on the premise that the best defense was offense. That a fighter agile enough to win every engagement needed no protection because it would never be on the receiving end. That premise had a hidden condition written under it in invisible ink. As long as we are winning. The entire design philosophy was sound only in victory. The moment the tide turned, every choice that had made the Zero great in attack made it helpless in defense. The lightness that had been a weapon became a liability. The omitted armor that had bought range and agility now bought nothing but funerals. A weapon that is only good while you are winning is, in a sense, not a war-winning weapon at all. It is a victory amplifier. It makes a strong position stronger and a winning hand more dominant. But war is the business of what happens when things go wrong. And a weapon must answer for the bad days as much as the good ones. The Zero had no answer for the bad days. It had been designed as though the bad days would not come. This is the heart of the engineer's later argument. The thing he seems to have understood from the beginning. The Navy had asked for a weapon optimized for a short, victorious war. He had given them exactly that. And the war was neither short nor, in the end, victorious. The mismatch was not in the execution. It was in the demand. And then came the final degradation. The use that turned the contradiction into something almost unbearable.
In the last year of the war, the Zero was given a final role, and it was the cruelest possible inversion of the one it was designed for. It had been built to win the fight for the sky, to clear the air of enemies and protect the fleet. By 1944 and 1945, with the air war lost and the enemy's carriers ranging at will, it was increasingly sent up not to fight, but to be expended, loaded with a bomb and flown deliberately into enemy ships by pilots who were not meant to return. The fighter that had been the proudest expression of the Navy's offensive doctrine became, in its last service, a guided weapon with a human being inside it. There is a terrible logic to how it ended there. An aircraft that could no longer win in the air, flown by pilots who could no longer be trained to the old standard, against an enemy that could no longer be matched. What use remained for it but the single, final, one-way mission? The lightness that had once given it the longest reach in the Pacific now mainly gave it the range to find a target to die against. The machine built to bring its pilot home had been stripped by the end, even of the pretense that home was the point. The fighter designed for air superiority finished the war as a piloted bomb. There is no harder way to state the distance between what it was meant to be and what it became.
The man who had designed it lived to see all of it, and lived long after. Jiro Horikoshi survived the war. He had spent much of it in poor health, away from the worst of the bombing that fell on the factories, and he came through to the peace that followed.
And in the years after, he did something that not every architect of a famous weapon chooses to do. He reflected, in writing, on what he had built and what it had been used for. And his reflections were not those of a proud man. We should be careful here and honest about the limits of the record. He did not leave behind a single dramatic confession that we can quote as a verdict on the whole war, and it would be false to invent one. But the posture that comes through his post-war writing is consistent and unmistakable. He suggested, in effect, that he had been a skilled craftsman serving a military and a national leadership whose judgment he did not share. That his technical gift had been spent in the service of a war he came to see as having been pursued by men who led the country toward ruin.
He later wrote, by the sense of his memoirs, as a man who had done his work as well as it could be done, and who grieved the use to which that work was put. It is the quietest kind of admission, and in some ways the most damning. Not that the aircraft failed, that the country had asked him for the wrong thing, and he built it.
Which brings the loop back to where it opened, and to the question we left hanging. What did the designer know before the first aircraft ever flew about the flaw that would kill the men who flew it? The answer the record supports is, he knew the trade. He knew at the drafting board that to meet the Navy's demands, he had to remove the pilot's protection, and he knew exactly what that protection was for. The fragility was not a defect that crept in. It was a decision, taken with open eyes, because the specification left no other path, and the doctrine of the day called it acceptable. He understood the bargain at the moment he made it. What he could not control was whether the war would stay the kind of war in which that bargain made sense. That is the seed of defeat the aircraft carried from the start. Not a hidden weakness, but an openly chosen one. A fighter optimized so completely for winning quickly that it had nothing left over for the long, grinding, losing years it was actually asked to fight. The engineer built precisely what he was told to build. The error was upstream of him, in the demand itself, and he seems to have known that too. So the most successful fighter Japan ever built was by the judgment of its own creator, the wrong weapon, brilliantly made, fatally conceived, and asked to win a war it had been designed only to begin.
Return, at the end, to the sentence we started with. The most successful fighter plane Japan ever built was designed to win the war in its first year, and to lose it in every year after. And now you can see why that is not a paradox, but a description. It was built light to win fast, and being built light to win fast is the same thing as being built fragile for any war that does not end fast. The strength and the weakness were never two qualities. They were one quality, seen from two sides of a turning point. Before the turn, it was the deadliest fighter in the Pacific. After the turn, it was a flying coffin for the best pilots a Navy ever had. And the man who drew it had understood at the drafting board that both of those aircraft were the same aircraft. He built it anyway, because the country asked, and an engineer in that Navy did not refuse the country. He spent the rest of his life in his quiet way, making sure the record showed that he had known. Next, on Tora files. The code breakers who proved Japan's most secret naval cipher had been read by the enemy for months, and the officers who saw the evidence and refused to believe it. Subscribe. The Pacific War told from the other side.